Hello, everyone, and welcome to the NeoSystems CMMC Town Hall. Now I'd like to introduce your host, David Carlino from NeoSystems. David?
Thank you very much, Don, and welcome everybody to our continuing series in Town Hall meetings. This is a kind of an Ask Me Anything session on cybersecurity maturity model certification. My name is David Carlino. You're probably used to seeing Ed Bassett in this seat, so I'm filling in for Ed, but don't worry, he'll be back next week. My role here in Neo is to lead the technical team, the technical team lead for the managed security services business. My role and title is a principal security consultant. So I'm spending my days developing and delivering our security products. Our guest today is Peter Dohm. Peter is the Chief Information Security Officer at Battelle and leads their corporate information technology group. For those of you that aren't familiar, Battelle is the largest research and development, nonprofit research and development corporation. They serve commercial, local, state, national government entities, and they focus on chemical and biological weapons mitigation, remediation, among many, many other things. So Peter's role is vast and varied, and he deals with a lot of both classified and unclassified information. So he brings that perspective to us today. I wanted to start us out by focusing on some of the differences that are going on between NIST 800-171 and CMMC. One of the major differences there is that you're transitioning from a follow the data model, the covered contractor information system model for NIST 800-171, and we're transitioning to a define the authorization boundary, the information system boundary, and authorization boundary ahead of your audit. And then you're going to talk to your auditor about what that boundary is. Your auditor is going to agree previous to your audit. So I wanted to ask Peter today about his experiences with that boundary, what kind of boundaries he's developing. For those of you who aren't totally familiar with the information system boundary, it often is a firewall. More and more, it's becoming a web browser where you're accessing some kind of remote desktop or VDI session. So Peter, in your experience, when you're defining an information system boundary, it seems to me from FISMA and FedRAMP that a remote desktop or virtual desktop is a perfectly acceptable boundary, and that the endpoint would not be in scope for audit, that the endpoint you're accessing that from is out of scope. Is that your experience as well?
So I have both experiences. I have some customers who've absolutely accepted the risk that the boundary stops at the bastion host or jump host or whatever we would like to call it, and that the data is contained within the boundary of whatever that infrastructure is that provides the remote desktop. Then there are customers who convince themselves that that data is at an impact level that it is just simply unacceptable for it to be released through any means beyond the quote unquote physical boundary of that system. And so they may do things like force us to have completely isolated workstations if we wanted to use something like a virtual desktop environment where these workstations are just as controlled essentially as the virtual desktop environment, which begs the question of why they exist in the first place, right? So, you know, in the boundaries that I have created in my career, I have probably created about an equal number where I had VDI accepted where VDI wasn't accepted for federal government customers. And these are usually federal information systems. These are not necessarily contractor owned, which is the very key difference here, because in those cases, the federal government was perfectly willing to accept the risk. They would say, you know, based on my risk calculus and me looking around at what I'm worried about, I'm totally okay accepting the risk that essentially one of my employees will use a BYOD and have a virtual desktop experience to remotely screen scrape this material and manipulate whatever they need to that's a controlled class of information. But when you have one of the ones who's a little bit more restrictive about their perspective, that leads you to a very different conclusion. And usually those are utter isolation, and they just don't want anything crossing streams. So, you know, that leads to some really interesting questions for CMMC, because you know, you and I have had this very conversation about, well, in CMMC, we defense contractors are no longer really allowed to assume risk. The government has essentially blanket assumed what risks we're allowed to take. And so if we are not allowed to have any assumed risk, that means we're not allowed to have any plans of actions and milestones for any findings on our systems. 100% compliance, right? We all understand this challenge in the regulation. Well, what exactly does that mean in the event that you have one customer who utterly, completely does not agree with the principle that a Bastion host with remote desktop is acceptable? So in which scenario do I find myself? Which auditors follow which school of thought, and what is my most likely mitigation strategy then? So we ourselves have been building on the assumption that we can build enclaves where we will be able to use VDI, because we do have a number of enclaves that we have built for government customers where this is perfectly acceptable. The unfortunate reality is that then we have to have a backup strategy, which is going to be something like, I might have to have Chromebooks, iPads, other Windows devices that are completely, totally locked down and isolated, just for the purposes of being able to enter that enclave. And perhaps the virtual desktop is removed from the equation to some degree. It
Right.
remains yet to be seen how that might go.
Right, right. And that's an interesting approach, giving them a very locked down machine to access a VDI when you don't trust that kind of in transit or presentation layer only protection.
Roger.
And that's your backup strategy.
Yeah.
Other backup strategies I've seen or heard tell as companies make these decisions, I think adding some sort of voluntary endpoint protection, or noting that these are from policy. We say they must have these basic attributes on the device.
Roger.
And from my understanding of CMMC, especially with the SPURS score, you do not lose SPURS score points for policy-based control around mobile devices. So
Roger.
it expressly says policy is just fine, don't subtract points. So it appears to me that backs up the notion in the SPURS scoring, getting closer to CMMC, but still not CMMC. So there's still not, I to this day haven't seen clear guidance from CMMC AB or C3PAOs, two of which now show up on the marketplace, on specifically whether or not that's going to be an acceptable model. My bet is on yes. And I think the next question that is for how long, or is that a forever strategy? So I like your backup strategy. I think that's thoughtful.
Yeah, it's so, I mean, it's clearly obvious to anyone who has watched this cat and mouse game that is essentially cyber offense and defense. At some point in time, there's going to be a clear and obvious piece of malware that's released that is literally just scraping frame buffers from something like a VDI and reconstructing documents. And so
technology which exists today.
Technology which exists today, but we haven't necessarily seen them in the wild under great use. It's going to happen at some point. And when that does, my worry is that the government suddenly decides, oh no, this strategy we had is simply not going to work. We're going to then change the game on you, after we defense contractors have, of course, spent an awful lot of our time and money trying to actually do the best with the regulations we have. So yeah.
Right. But I think you're very much on the path of enclaves, and enclaves only, for this kind of data, enclaves for this kind of data. So it would appear in your experience, and you made some comments about small, medium, large businesses. Just to touch on that briefly, for the large businesses, it would seem that's the go-to strategy. Many enclaves, mission-specific enclaves. For many small companies, they need one enclave. Many small companies that are going after that level 3 certification have to date never seen any CUI and likely never will. But the contracts they want to bid on say pass, not in a planned way, have and pass an audit. And to me, it's a bit of a, for the small companies, it's almost like go buy a fire safe. You're never going to put anything in there, but you can't do business with the government unless you have one and the inspector saw it, right? So it's almost like just build something, have us come look at it. It can be small, large, as long as you have one, we're fine with it. And then there's that sort of everything in between, whether you have engineers that have to be on heavy video card centric processing capabilities near to their servers with big data moving back and forth, or you can go full cloud. It seems that middle ground of companies is, sort of struggling with, I don't want to take my whole company through. Are you at all an advocate for the model where you sort of build an apparatus to build enclaves, if you will? So you basically say to a small company, you're going to need, or sorry, a medium-sized company, you're going to need more than one enclave. Corporate and CUI at minimum. So perhaps consider a third sort of apparatus, I'll call it, that manages those two. Have you guys implemented a sort of management tier or central corporate wide versus all these enclaves? How do you balance that very system specific and corporate model?
Yeah, so perfect question. The model that we have chosen is to basically brutally automate the management of enclaves. So what we have built is using things like Terraform, et cetera, an automation framework where we are building, in this case, Azure, but it really doesn't have to be just Azure. There's just a little bit more work to do to kind of generalize this across different cloud service providers. So automate the construction of these enclaves, and then using kind of the old school language, a general support system for those of us who built information systems in the past, where we had this kind of umbrella of controls, and then we would inherit for a particular application, we were deploying 90% plus of that umbrella and only really have to document the deviations in a system security plan. That's essentially the approach we're taking here, where we are building a framework to automate all of the enclave construction, and then even to some degree, as much of the documentation as we can possibly automate. And then only really have small deviations here and there for one enclave versus another. Certainly there are going to be workloads that deviate outside the traditional services boundary. I don't mean boundary, the services offering. So for example, let's say that one program, what we're doing is we're basically isolating program by program and containing the blast radius around every single program. So if something goes sideways in one, it really doesn't affect the others with a very high degree of confidence. So what that implies then is you might have a program that just uses, I'll make up an example, SharePoint and Teams and Office 365 and Outlook, and that's about it. And that's the only thing that team needs. And then another team might have some other application, to use your example, might have to do some crunching on CAD or solid modeling or who knows what. And those might need to have VPNs strung back to an enterprise where they actually have something at their desk, because the actual cost to do the same thing in the cloud service is actually considerably higher than if we had already invested in some of these things. So we're kind of building this hybrid model where we can reuse the best of the on-premise infrastructure that we bought already, but still contain blast radius as much as we can from program to program.
Yeah, that's interesting. So you're maybe building an on-premise environment and a cloud environment totally separate, but it makes you as an organization running essentially in a hybrid mode. You've got cloud, you've got on-premise, you need expertise of both. It's almost like you're coming up with repeatable models, the car model, the truck model, and picking the right one for the mission.
Exactly. Now, that said, we are trying to minimize the use of on-premise stuff for most things. It's really just for those things where we have a really significant asset we invested in over a long period of time.
Sure. Have you guys been able to find cloud processing that is capable of doing 3D modeling and some of the harder heavy processing?
I won't say that's an easy problem to solve. Yes, that's a somewhat solvable problem, but it is not an entirely cheap thing. You will find that for the most part, your local on-premise stuff ends up being a more cost-effective model for those.
Yeah, we found that same thing. And I think the challenge there again is you become a hybrid company whether you want to or not. As soon as you decide you're going to enter into that kind of computing, you've decided there will be a computer and there'll be a server probably. Any key takeaways you found from this enclave creating tool that you would recommend to people? I mean, as you look at, again, a medium company, they can't automate everything. They maybe don't have people that write automation scripts or code. Is that the kind of thing that you think a medium company, is that an approach you think a medium-sized company could use? Or do you think they'd have to certainly they're manually writing their documentation. Perhaps on the build side of things, they'd be automating some stuff, manual, some stuff.
I think we're going to see, and to a large degree, we sort of already are, we're going to see companies who are building an entire services model on this idea of essentially a semi-business in a box, right? So we can construct the vast majority of your controls documentation, we can construct the vast majority of your enclaves for you, et cetera. Now, when you move up to a medium-sized company, they're probably not going to want to outsource all of that. They're probably going to want to have a good chunk of that in-house. So I can imagine that there will probably be individuals who release some of this in open source form over time. their Terraform scripts and things like that. But I could also imagine others who will consider that very much kind of their special sauce and not want to release it. So I would say, if you think about Azure as just kind of a baseline, and I'm not saying that it's the only option here, but if you think of it as a baseline, one can implement their CMMC controls model really pretty straightforwardly. And then in the customer responsibility matrix, you have to deal with all the processes that go around that, of course. But you can get the vast majority of simple problems solved using that basic model. Right. So, you think about a medium-sized company, probably 70% of your workloads are going to be reasonably simple, and then 30 are going to be more complicated and nuanced. And so maybe the answer is you essentially start with something closer to a business in the box type of approach to get the basic ones covered with the pertinent technical controls, and then your documentation that follows up from that, and then deal with all the others sort of as a one-off.
Yeah, that's well put. And I tend to see that same approach. I mean, it's a little bit too much to eat the whole elephant, right? And for many companies that have never started this, I also think of it as a bit of a challenge of the recurring nature of operating a security program. I think is very surprising to a lot of our customers, quite honestly, that it's not just buy the box and then look at it. There's a lot of quarterly, semi-annual, annual things
processes
that need to be put in place, right?
Yep. There are processes you just have to execute. You don't have a choice. And
for those small ones, I agree. In a box with just, hey, go look at the 5 people that have an account and tell me it's good. As soon as that becomes 100 people, it's like, well, I don't know. I mean, they don't all work for me. I don't know. Do I send it out to somebody? You have to invent a process, write it down, and give it to the auditor. So that brings me to another point, writing it down. These enclaves, I tend to view a system security plan as per enclave. We tend to write our documentation per enclave, meaning a single company may have more than one system security plan. It's for a small company, again, very easy. For a big company, plenty of resources, very easy. For a lot of that, everybody else in the middle. I think there's an engineering workload and there's a manufacturing workload, and they may be very, very different. And it's tempting to write 2 system security plans. And it's also tempting to mix them up into one because it feels like extra effort. You nodded your head. It seems like you more stick to that individual one plan per system model.
So I think historically we definitely had one plan per system model. Again, back to the general support system type of notion from the olden days, we would really like to make it so that there is essentially one certification for the management framework that deals with the whole umbrella. And then I don't have to actually have a certification for anything but the umbrella. I will have different system security plans for each of the slices taken from that umbrella. And I honestly don't know whether this is something that the CMMC AB has necessarily considered as one of their basic models that contractors will use. It's something that we used many years ago very successfully on a bunch of classified programs as well as other unclassified programs. But I haven't seen this discussed. This, again, we have no scoping documents, so we don't really know.
We do not yet have a scoping document. That's very true. I will say for each of those system security plans and the corporate issued controls, certainly FedRAMP works on that model as well.
Roger.
Obviously, FISMA is used to that inherit controls model as well, and control tailoring.
There should be no reason why this isn't acceptable, right? By logic.
Seemingly, that seems to be true. I had a chance to talk with some of the CMMC AB members in one of these conversations, and I asked about, from a documentation standpoint, how they would approach having a federal contract information system and separately a CUI system. And do you need documentation for both? Because FCI doesn't necessarily need documentation. And the answer is very interesting. Maybe you would think about writing a corporate-wide system security plan, and then all your underling system security plans may reference it, which I thought was interesting. And the reason that they had advocated for that was if your corporate, if the controls you're inheriting from corporate themselves are not written down properly, then you can't inherit them.
Of course.
And I think that's an interesting takeaway for many organizations. You do need to write down the system security plan, the technical controls for your organization. But you do also have to write down all of the HR controls somewhere,
Physical
and then you can
security
reference
controls.
them, but you
Yep.
may have to write them into this plan if you've never written them down before.
Roger. Yep. Do notice that we have a question there from Kelly Hall.
I did not see it. If you want to go ahead and take that one.
So the question is, what will C3PAOs look at and use to determine if the boundary that we have defined is acceptable to them? I'd love to hear your answer, David.
Oh, well, thank you. I have asked this question of Neil Beggin at Cherry Beckert and Reagan of the CMMC AB, and their answer to this question was that it's up to each auditor and each organization at the outset of your audit to look at the authorization boundary and agree that it is an effective and appropriate one.
Yep, and that's
so
what I've
long
heard
as you
as well.
both agree, it should not be another question during the assessment.
That's exactly what I've heard as well.
And actually, in your as you guys have thought about C3PAOs, have you looked at or considered integrating your audits, your CMMC audits with other audits? Is this a standalone effort for you?
This is actually a standalone effort for us. We have independently approached auditors for this. We of course have, financial auditors and all of that long since lined up for generation. This is something that we have not fully decided. There is certainly a potential for us to roll this in with the auditors who perform greater auditing duties for the enterprise. Thus far, though, the ones we've been talking to have been smaller entities, and we wanted to build a good relationship with them just to understand if that benefited us to actually look outside our traditional auditing model.
Sure. And we're in the throes of that same conversation. It's a very different kind of an audit.
Yep, exactly.
One other question I would have, in your experience with changing information systems, obviously in our system security documentation, we write down change management, change control in our configuration management plan. So in speaking with CMMC and with a 3-year audit cycle, one would expect the environment that you took through audit 1 year and the environment you're going to take through audit the following 3 years later likely will look very different. One of the questions we've been having for potential auditors or in general is there the concept of a significant change? Can you change your system so much that you need to go back through audit? I'm curious if you've heard anything or considered that, or are you thinking we'll audit and 3 years later we'll audit again?
We have been assuming that we're going to be completely auditing everything again in 3 years. So I've thought about this. I've asked the question of a number of individuals, especially other CISOs and such, and everyone has sort of scratched their head and said, we're not really sure how they're going to treat this particular dimension of the challenge.
Agreed.
So I have just said, worst case scenario, everything gets audited again, and that's just the way it's going to have to be.
Right.
Now, that said, because we are basically managing nearly everything with infrastructure as code for our enclaves, it does become a very straightforward notion of understanding precisely what has changed, because everything will be in source code control and clearly indicatable to any auditor. Right. So I think, that could bode well for us, but to be honest, again, until we see rubber hit the road, it's unknown.
Right. Yeah, and I think as I've gotten closer and closer to audit, that kind of a question, significant change, when to call the auditor back, has continued to become things that haven't been defined yet, realistically. Exactly. So I also wanted to, as we close out, to take us all the way back to our conversation about authorization boundaries, and how you would draw that out and what kind of image you use. I'm assuming you guys have had to draw red lines around your boundaries. Is that a concept you're familiar with? Yeah,
so in this case, the boundary in our scenario, since we're talking about building incredibly contained blast radii around programs, the boundary is really straightforward until you start talking about software as a service platforms, right? The moment essentially my boundary includes a arm out to a software as a service platform that is FedRAMP accredited. Does that reside within or not the boundary of this particular program, right? That's the ever-present question. But generally speaking, we have composed boundaries around our programs so that it is so blatantly obvious what this particular program's assets are that are inside the boundary, and no one can ever misconstrue when an audit comes by, this is so clearly obvious. Again, modulo the software as a service platforms, which will have a dotted line around.
That's right. That's right. Okay. And we really struggle mightily with that same question. External services, third-party services, SaaS services, are they in my boundary or am I leveraging them? I think FedRAMP, for instance, has a very, very well-defined security metadata concept, and security metadata is treated just like federal data. CMMC, as far as I can tell, does not have a security metadata definition.
I agree.
Meaning,
I don't see it.
Perhaps logs and vulnerability scans, both considered federal data under FedRAMP, are seemingly left out of this CUI level 3 model. So to me, those are black lines, not red lines, carrying CUI on the map.
Roger.
Sounds like that's your experience as well.
Yeah, I think so.
Cool. Any other troubles you've had with that definition? Kind of areas where you felt like, wow, I wish I would have considered the printer and shredder, because those have come up for me many times in the past.
Yeah, so we haven't really addressed printing too terribly concisely yet. We've the basic principle is that printing, for example, would be where we would actually have an accredited printer inside the boundary with a VPN tunnel in front of that device, delivering it into the enclave for that particular program, which does present a whole bunch of interesting challenges. If I have 20 different programs, do I need 20 different printers? That is the really unpleasant part of that conversation. So we're still trying to kind of understand the most appropriate way of handling that and kind of generalizing printing, in a way that still is defensible from an audit and boundaries perspective. And I don't think we've answered these questions very well yet. That we're still struggling through. Yeah,
and we tend to look at it as physical media and must be handled or protected, but certainly it throws a wrench in the gears a lot of the time for us. We've got a question here on R&D labs where the government requires support for unsupported systems. And that one is common that I see. Our general approach to that is to isolate. I think the control set reads that any unsupported information system has to live in its own little enclave. Is that how you would read that as well?
That is exactly what we're doing. We're basically isolating every single thing into its own enclave that has relationships to the primary enclave, usually using, if it's something where it can write up into the enclave, that's a pretty easy one. If things have to write down, that's a whole different beast. But generally speaking, 99% of our cases, it's things like instrumentation. So think mass spectrometers or something like that. And we might have a case where the device has to write up into the enclave. So those are pretty straightforward. Then there's a very, very clearly defined interface and boundary between the actual system holding the controlled and classified and the system that is producing data that eventually makes it to become controlled and classified.
Yeah, almost a one-way valve.
Yep, almost a one-way valve, almost a cross-domain device.
Right. Second question we got on here, I think fits with that nicely. Consider it acceptable to define your scope and scope your boundary by VLANing off systems, or do you add a switch, for instance? Do you need to fully separate out on a physical segment, or is it just okay to have one VLAN? I know that's a complicated question there.
This conversation comes up an awful lot, and we've had this conversation with a government customer within the last month. And that particular government customer felt that the impact level of the data that they wanted to have controlled was high enough that they wanted complete and total physical isolation between the controlled VLANs and the uncontrolled VLANs. They were perfectly fine with multiple controlled VLANs on the same switching hardware with some firewall between them, but they were not okay with controlled and uncontrolled VLANs on the same switching hardware. So, I can't say that that's a policy, because I agree. That was one customer who had a very, very specific set of opinions. I think you will find a different opinion for every customer, unfortunately.
I think that's a very good answer, and I tend to agree. And there's a lot of context that probably comes into answering that for your information system as well.
Agree.
We're at our 30-minute mark though, so I want to thank you honestly for joining us, and appreciate all your insights.
Thank you so much for having me.
Don, I'm not sure if you were going to close us out. If not, everybody is welcome to join us next week. Ed will be back in the presenter's chair. So we appreciate all your time, and please do continue to send in questions. We try to answer them in the town hall sessions week over week.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you all.
Thanks, everyone.